Tony, good to talk to you again. We spoke to you early in the week. You were very, very sceptical about your own Liberal colleague Stephen Marshall and this dramatic lockdown. It's just exposed now as a really bad, overblown, panicked move, isn't it?
Well, it seems to be that way, Chris. The sense in South Australia right now is one, as we've just heard, of relief, but I think that will quickly turn to disappointment and frustration. Frustration that the lockdown measures haven't ended immediately, they've just been relaxed. But disappointment that we haven't learnt the lessons of the lockdown in Victoria and the management of the COVID crisis by Berejiklian in New South Wales. We didn't learn the lessons from Victoria in terms of how we managed Medi hotels. And in terms of New South Wales, I said on your program a couple of days ago, we need to operate in a way that looks to suppress the virus, not eliminate it. If we'd taken that approach, then we wouldn't have had 2 million South Australians in lockdown, and we wouldn't have a situation where their lives have been thrust into the kind of inconvenience and uncertainty that I've experienced and my fellow South Australians have experienced. And, you know, this afternoon I've just been reflecting on everything I've been through, the changes that have had to be made in my own personal life and these things, and I've just times it by 2 million, and I just think to myself, goodness gracious, on the evidence of one individual. I've got a background as a criminal lawyer, and the first thing I was ever taught was never to trust anyone and test assertions, and I'm worried that that didn't happen in this case and we just rushed to a statewide lockdown.
Well, that's a ruse, isn't it, for Stephen Marshall and the police commissioner just to blame the lie told by one pizza worker customer is a ruse, isn't it? That they're using him as a scapegoat. Their responsibility is to assess all of the evidence and all of the information and make a wise decision, not to slap down a whole state into the most brutal lockdown we've seen in this country and say they wouldn't have done it if the pizza guy told them the truth.
Well, that's my point, Chris. My point is that that lie, having been told, needed to have been tested, and there are lots of other ways to assess that evidence before you take the very drastic moves that were taken. I'd really implore South Australians not to seek to take this out on one individual, and I'm really hopeful that we learn the lessons of this overreaction. And unless we get an acknowledgement that it was in fact an error, I'm worried we won't learn those lessons, Chris, and so that's why the apology is important from my perspective. It's important because it needs to be an acknowledgement that we're not going to follow this similar path again, and that rather than look for an eradication type approach or an elimination approach, we look to operate much more like Premier Berejiklian, who's doing a fantastic job, and look to operate in a suppression world. I mean, Premier Berejiklian has dealt with more outbreaks of greater numbers, and not once has she looked to lock her state down. And I'm very concerned not only about the impact this has had on small businesses over this period, but the impact it's going to have in terms of the uncertainty it generates. I mean, I worry about the very fact that people are now going to think twice about booking a holiday to South Australia, for example. And
not just South Australia, Tony. It's a damp on confidence right across the country. Now, what should the repercussions be for the Public Health Officer, Nicola Spurrier, and for the Premier, Stephen Marshall? What should change as the result of this stuff-up?
Well, there needs to be an immediate investigation, and I'd like the public to be made aware of exactly what measures were undertaken to investigate the evidence or position in relation to this individual so we can make an assessment. But Chris, I know others like you have made pretty strong calls. I'll leave that for commentators. I want to know that these mistakes aren't going to be made again, and the only way I can have confidence in that is if the decision makers come out and acknowledge that this was not the right course of action. And I was disappointed that they sought to maintain today that this was in fact the right approach, when I think Blind Freddie could tell you that it was an overreaction and unnecessarily harsh on South Australians.
Spot on. Thanks for talking to us, Tony. I appreciate that. Tony Pasin, who's a South Australian Federal Liberal MP there, being critical, frankly, openly and fairly critical of the South Australian Liberal Premier there, Stephen Marshall, for not at least admitting the error and apologising.